you see low social capital essentially in all post-communist countries. This country, Georgia, is an example of this. Social capital is pretty low in this country, and one possible explanation would be that this is a communist legacy again. The high social capital in Europe is in Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, etc. And these people are very happy to trust strangers, but when they go on for a holiday in Turkey, they probably don't trust the people who, the guy who wants to sell them a carpet and tells them this is real silk and it's really valuable. They probably would distrust that person a bit more than a similar carpet salesman in Oslo. This is a paper on social capital and specifically on how persistent social capital is. And as such, it goes actually to some extent against what has been accepted more or less as a consensus in the literature on social capital, that social capital is very highly persistent. And if you have a change in social capital, or if you have, if for whatever reason social capital has been destroyed, this has very highly persistent or permanent effects. But before I get there, let me just go very quickly. You probably know what social capital is, but there is considerable literature on this. In the last 20 or so years, maybe 30 years, it has become quite a popular topic. Essentially, social capital is seen as another factor of production, something that increases productivity of people, makes it easier for them to cooperate, makes them less likely to free ride. And the things that we associate with social capital, there's a number of manifestations of social capital. One is the quality and quantity of interpersonal relationships. And you can think of this as how many friends you have. Real friends and Facebook friends, especially the real ones. How many good acquaintances you have, people that you can rely on if you need something. Another measure is civic or voluntary participation. This is membership in voluntary organizations, clubs, sports teams, choirs and bands and orchestras, etc. Basically, when people meet together for a joint purpose and they engage in some sort of joint activity for the purpose of pleasure or something else. It could be charities, it could be religious organizations that may be motivated by altruistic considerations. But again, people meet together, they interact, they cooperate for a sort of shared purpose. And the most common manifestation of social capital is trust and reciprocity. Essentially, to what extent people are prepared to trust each other, and in particular, to what extent people are prepared to trust strangers, other people that they haven't met yet or that they don't know particularly closely. Now, I said that there are these three manifestations of social capital. These are essentially the main measures that people use in the literature to express or to measure social capital. They're essentially, the idea is that there's a sort of a Latin concept of social capital behind these measures, and these are proxies for social capital. So you will see people who look at civic participation and they call it social capital. Other people will look at trust and they will also call it social capital. Unlike physical capital, social capital is not particularly easy to measure, and that's why we look for proxies. But in general, we assume that a person who has high stock of social capital will have high stocks of these three measures. And there's a huge literature which shows that social capital has all kinds of favorable implications at the individual level or aggregate level. Yes?
So you don't distinguish between this bridging and binding social capital?
Well, there's further classification, but for the time being, I'm talking about social capital in relatively general and broad terms. But yeah, there's a bridging and bonding capital, social capital, essentially whether you have these kind of strong ties to sort of members of your peer group or to strangers. So this would be more likely to be, this is more likely to be bonding capital, social capital. Trust, especially what is referred to as generalized trust, is more like a bridging capital. It's essentially that it allows you to build bridges to other people. Again, even people that you haven't met before. So there are these distinctions. I don't dwell on it too much in my paper. I have measures of social capital that can be associated with either type of social capital, both bridging and bonding. Right. One of the main sources, one of the contributions popularizing the concept of social capital has been a book by Robert Putnam, Making Democracy Work, published in 1990s. And this is actually kind of the key point of the book. He argues that, so everybody knows that in Italy, in the south, things are very different from the north. North is rich, industrialized, productive, efficient. The south is underdeveloped, corrupt. Basically, there's all kinds of economic and social issues in the south. And Putnam actually made a number of trips to Italy and did sort of detailed research in a number of regions in north and south. And he came up with a hypothesis where he argued that this difference reflects long-term historical legacies. And the legacy that he talks about is essentially after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, the south was initially briefly conquered by the Arabs, but then it was conquered by Normans. Basically, these were Norman or Norse pilgrims going to the Holy Land, and on the way they stopped in Sicily, and they liked it so much that they decided to stay, and they established a kingdom in the south of Italy. And so there was a relatively highly centralized and pretty authoritarian state in the south, whereas in the north, there were the various city-states, Venice, Genova, and basically the north was more fragmented. And at the same time, the north was a lot more liberal. Now, this, again, it goes back essentially 1,000 years, almost 1,000 years. The Norman kingdom has been established around the turn of, on the border between the first and the second millennium. And ever since then, there was this division of Italy until Italian unification about 150 years ago. And again, so Putnam argues that this has had long-term historical legacies and long-term economic, social, and political implications that are still tangible today. The differences that we observe is there is high civic participation, high levels of trust in the north, basically high social capital, and essentially things work well. Again, north is relatively highly productive, industrialized, etc. Whereas in the south, there's low social capital, the economic development is lagging far behind, unemployment is high, and there's a lot of organized crime. And that's actually one of the manifestations, according to the story, that's one of the legacies that this culture of mistrust, this legacy of mistrust, created fertile ground for the organized crime in the south. And you can see that if you look at this map, this is what they call pizzo in Italy, which is when businesses pay protection money to the mafia or to organized crime. The mafia is actually only in Sicily, but then there's Camorra, Ndrangheta, and one more. But basically, there's organized crime in the south. Businesses may be asked by a local organized crime boss to pay a fee so that their business doesn't burn down or doesn't get robbed or whatever. And if they pay, they're protected by this particular clan. If they don't pay, then it may well happen that the next day the business will actually burn down. And again, so there's a big difference. In the south, a lot of businesses pay this kind of protection money. In the north, there are some regions where this is relatively common, but there are other regions where essentially nobody does. And again, this is seen as one of the legacies. Basically, if you look at the Norman kingdom on this map, and if you look at the part of Italy that has a problem with organized crime, it's almost a perfect match. And so again, this is seen as one of the legacies of this historical division of Italy into the south with a very authoritarian regime that engendered distrust and sort of centralized decision-making. And the north, which was a lot more liberal and more democratic. And as a result, there's higher trust, higher social capital in the north. again, so that was Putnam. This is basically the argument by Robert Putnam. And that created quite a lot of interest in economic and political science alike. And so there's a number of papers that actually try to test this. And they generally tend to find evidence in line with this. And so maybe the best paper is this one, Guizot, Sapienza, and Zingales. So they test this econometrically. They have data, regional data for Italy. And essentially the nice thing that they do is they point out that it's not only that there was a difference between North and South, but there were also, so the South was highly centralized and authoritarian. And that's essentially Putnam's argument. The North was predominantly liberal and decentralized, but there were different states in the North. There was basically a number of states, and some of them were similar to the Norman Kingdom in the South. And so they use this distinction that there are also regions in the North which were relatively authoritarian, and so there shouldn't only be the difference between North and South, there should also be difference between different regions within the North. And they actually find that, and so they identify what were free city-states by around the 10th to 12th century in the North, and not all regions of the North were free city-states. And then they confirm that there is a gap in terms of social capital within North between what used to be free city-states, relatively liberal regions and relatively authoritarian regions. And there's also a similar gap between North and South. And they argue that essentially this historical legacy explains up to 1/2 of the North-South gap in social capital, the difference between North and South. And they use these sorts of variables and difference in difference. And they basically find this being quite robust. Tabellini extends this to European regions, so beyond Italy, and he finds essentially the same kind of pattern. The regions where decision-making has been was decentralized historically have better culture and higher per capita incomes at the same time. And now culture, social capital would be one of the aspects of culture. He uses a somewhat broader concept, but as far as I remember, social capital would be one of them. This is a theoretical model, which let me skip that. Now that's social capital. And of course, as you probably know, there's a lot of literature that looks at persistence of institutions in general. And so there's a number of papers by Acemoglu with various co-authors, where they look at historical origins of present-day institutions, and they argue largely that present-day institutions in less developed countries have much to do, or in former colonies rather, have much to do with the nature of colonization and the nature of exposure to colonization. The countries, the former colonies where Europeans established extractive institutions, essentially to maximize wealth transfer from the colonies to the colonial empire. They inherited these institutions and essentially continue having inefficient institutions to present day, whereas other colonies where more liberal institutions were put in place during the colonial period do better now in terms of institutions and also economically. There's a number of papers by Nathan Nunn who looks at institutional legacy of slavery, and he finds similar conclusions. There's a number of papers that look at former empires in Europe, and essentially they look at the distinction between, it's essentially Central and Eastern Europe, Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, where there were originally 3 or 4 empires: Prussian, Russian, Habsburg, and Ottoman, so 4 empires. And present-day countries oftentimes incorporate parts that used to be in different empires. So one example of this is Poland, which is Grosvenor and Żurawskaya, Wysokinska, to some extent Becker et al. Looks at that. And Poland, as you might know, was divided since early 1800s or late 1700s between Habsburg, Prussian, and Russian Empire. And this partition of Poland essentially ended up with different parts of present-day Poland being subject to different institutions, different rule for more than a century. And these papers argue that you can still see economic as well as institutional legacies of this. This paper, Dimitrov, Greisel, Grosjean, Roland, and Karaya look at more the difference between Habsburg and Ottoman empires. And again, so for instance, Romania is split. What now is Romania incorporates parts that used to be Ottoman and parts that used to be Habsburg. Serbia, similarly. Parts of today, present-day Serbia used to be Habsburg, such as Vojvodina, whereas other parts used to be run by the Ottomans, Croatia as well, and so on. So you have these differences, and you can essentially use this some sort of difference in difference or a regression discontinuity type of approach, and they find important legacies. And a very interesting paper is this one, Vogtländer and Thorpe, and they essentially look at a particular historical legacy, the Black Death period in Europe, which took place in 1300s, 1340s. It was a period when a large part of European population died in a major plague epidemic, and in certain parts of Europe, Jews were blamed for this. They were essentially used as a scapegoat, and this resulted in the persecution and pogroms against Jews. Now, they look at Germany, and they identify the variation in how much Jews were persecuted during the Black Death period. They find that this correlates with persecution of Jews essentially 600 years later during the Nazi period. So the parts of Germany that in 1300s were slaughtering Jews, essentially as punishment for this Black Death epidemic, were also the parts where Jews were more likely to be deported to concentration camps, treated badly, denounced publicly, etc. And so it appears that cultural attitudes can actually be highly persistent, not just a few generations, but a few centuries. And so essentially, the bottom line is institutions, whether formal or informal, whether it's social capital, culture, or formal institutions, they tend to be highly persistent. There's a lot of literature that backs this up. Now, if this is the case, it potentially has important implications. And so one example is North versus South Italy. And essentially, the prediction based on this, based on the Putnam argument, is actually pretty gloomy for Italy, because the south of Italy is kind of stuck in an inefficient equilibrium. People have low social capital because social capital has been destroyed, and the legacy of this destruction of social capital is going to be permanent, and if not permanent, highly persistent, and it will take centuries for South Italy to actually catch up with the North. Now, given that social capital has been shown to be an important predictor of economic development and human capital, etc., all kinds of positive outcomes are associated with social capital, this can be an important impediment to economic and social development of the south of Italy. Now, similar argument has been made about post-communist countries, formerly communist countries such as this one, where the argument basically is as follows: communism, and especially the kind of communism that was in place during Stalin times, this also destroyed social capital, in the sense that it was a very authoritarian regime where you couldn't really trust anyone, because your neighbor, your spouse, your best friend could be an informer who would turn you in. And there were actually cases during the Stalinist period that husbands would report on wives and vice versa, children would report on their parents, and people would get arrested for making a joke or a sort of frivolous remark in front of friends or in front of members of the family that would get reported to the KGB, and they would end up being deported or deported to Siberia or put in prison or worse. And so if you have this kind of situation, you learn not to trust anyone. And this is exactly what Putnam had in mind when he talks about Italy, that in Italy you have this culture of mistrust. The same kind of culture of mistrust should have been created in the communist countries during the communist period, And if social capital, if the destruction of social capital is highly persistent, then this might have permanent effects. And as a result of that, countries such as this one, and basically all of the former Soviet Union and other former communist countries, will struggle with this legacy for generations or centuries. And so essentially that's what Parliament Svensson is one of the papers, for instance, that makes this point. So this is sort of the starting point of my paper. I want to see whether this is really the case. And yeah, please.
So, I mean, this is only a negative persistence. So, lack of social capital is persisting. While one might argue in Italy, now they had democracy for whatever, 60 years or something. And in that time, they have rebuilt their social capital. And now this rebuilt social capital will have long-lasting effects for centuries to come. But this he doesn't do. He only says once it's destroyed, it's away. He doesn't say when we have a time of democracy, let's say for 20 years, that this will have a long-run effect in the other direction.
That's exactly the point. Basically, once you destroy social capital, it's very difficult to rebuild.
Okay.
And so even though, so in Italy, it's been reunified since 1860s. So basically 150 years of common legal system, not always democratic, not always liberal, but there was a common political system, common legal system, the same, more or less the same institutions, legal and otherwise, in place. And, generally a lot of unifying factors were at work. But again, the argument of Putnam and others is that this all is not enough. And the fact that, as you say, for the last 60 years, Italy was a democratic country, which should be conducive to rebuilding of social capital. But again, once you destroyed it, it's not easy to rebuild, the argument goes. And so, despite this, it will take maybe a few centuries until the south of Italy converges in terms of social capital to the north. And by and large, as far as I think when people compare, when studies compare north and south of Italy, you still have lower levels of social capital or trust, etc., in the south than in the north. Whether there was any convergence or not, I actually have data to look into that, but I didn't do that. But that's one thing I should probably do. But for instance, in terms of the post-communist countries, you see low social capital essentially in all post-communist countries. This country, Georgia, is an example of this. Social capital is pretty low in this country, and one possible explanation would be that this is a communist legacy again. There might be other explanations, such as it's a country that relatively recent was invaded by another country, etc. But yeah, there's an important degree of asymmetry in the sense that if you have a negative shock, that has permanent effects. If after that you have a positive shock, that may not actually undo the effect of the previous negative shock. Now, in the case of the UK was a pretty liberal country for a long time, and so there, the negative shock is absent. They didn't have this episode that would destroy social capital, so that when they had this positive shock where they were sort of unifying in the struggle against Germany and in resistance against the bombing or whatever, resilience. Yeah, I take your point, but it's a different setting. It's not the same as in south of Italy, because south of Italy has been afflicted by the negative shock in the first place. So, yeah. Anyway, so basically, like I just said, I'm not a great fan of this. I always found it a bit, I was always a bit uncomfortable about this argument that once you destroy it, it's essentially permanent. It's for good. And so I wanted to test this. Now, the issue is how do you test it? And an ideal situation would be to construct an experiment. But it's not easy to experiment on a country, especially you would like to have some sort of randomized trial where you take a country such as, say, Georgia, and then you expose part, you select villages and you expose some villages to some sort of negative shock that will cause people to learn not to trust one another. You leave other villages as the control group, and then you come back 50, 60 years later and you observe what happened. Now, the government of Georgia probably wouldn't be very happy about a researcher proposing this and asking for funding. So, you know, we can't really do this kind of experiments. The second best approach is a natural experiment. And I believe I have found a natural experiment that is suitable. Specifically, there's a number of regions in Europe, and actually elsewhere as well, but I essentially only use European regions. There's a number of regions that experienced border changes, mainly in the wake of the Second World War. And unlike after previous border changes, after the Second World War, to some extent also after the First World War, but I don't consider that, but after the Second World War, the regions that were annexed by another country were typically depopulated. The original population was removed, and they were replaced by settlers from the victorious country. And I found a number of examples where this was the case. And this is my natural experiment. Now, the key assumption behind this natural experiment is that social capital, to some extent at least, is embedded in interpersonal ties, in the sense, or at least it's context dependent. So even if you're prepared to trust strangers, you trust the kind of strangers that are to some extent familiar to you. And to give you an example of this, the high social capital in Europe is in Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, etc. And these people are very happy to trust strangers, but when they go for a holiday in Turkey, they probably don't trust the people who, you know, the guy who wants to sell them a carpet and tells them this is real silk and it's really valuable. They probably would distrust that person a bit more than a similar carpet salesman in Oslo. And so trust is context dependent. You trust strangers as long as these strangers are the kind of people that you think you know how to read them, how to predict their behavior. If the context changes, then you don't really know whether you can trust your neighbors as much as you would trust your neighbors in your home village. Because in your home village, everybody would go to the same church, everybody would speak the same dialect or with the same accent, everybody would follow the same customs. Now, if you move to another region and your neighbor comes from the same country but a completely different region, speaks with a different accent, maybe going to a different church, you know, maybe you are Protestant and your neighbor is Catholic or something like that, and you would be probably less certain about whether that person can be trusted. On top of it, like I said, a lot of social capital is really based on interpersonal relationship, in the sense that if you stay in your home village, you can go to essentially any house in the street, even if you don't know them very well. And if you need to borrow money or you need to borrow a cup of flour, you can knock on their door and ask them, and they would give it to you because they know who you are, and you know they have certain degree of trust, and they can expect that you would reciprocate this. But again, if you move to a different region and the neighbor is someone completely different from you, you would be less likely to be able to get this kind of favor from your new neighbors. So essentially, that's my natural experiment. One problem with this is I don't actually observe social capital throughout what would be the experimental period, in the sense that I would like to observe social capital immediately after repopulation and then see how it changes. The problem is there were no surveys 60 years ago when these repopulation episodes were taking place, and I only get to measure social capital something like 50 years later. Now, if social capital is highly persistent, that shouldn't matter, because if these regions were subjected to a negative shock that destroyed at least some of the social capital that people possessed, we should still observe it 1 or 2 generations later. So the other possible criticism is that this kind of repopulation actually doesn't destroy social capital. That's potentially serious, I found one reference that actually looked at one of the regions that I'm considering, Sudetenland, which was a German majority part of what is now the Czech Republic, and essentially almost all, the vast majority of the Germans were kicked out, expelled after the war, and they were replaced by settlers. This is actually a sociological study of this region, and he makes exactly the point that I assume in this kind of experiment, that the people who moved there, they didn't socialize, they didn't participate in voluntary activities, and most importantly, they never felt at home. They always felt that they were visiting these people. When they would say, I'm going home on Saturday, it wasn't going home to the house where they lived, it was going home to the home village where their grandparents were born. And it was only the second generation, the people who were born actually in Sudetenland, who started to feel at home there. And so it took quite a considerable period of time for this sort of adjustment to occur. And that's exactly what I assume with, this negative shock that destroys social capital. So I would assume, based on these assumptions, are based on the evidence in the study, that there was a negative shock. And now, essentially, the question I want to answer in my paper is, when I observe social capital 50 to 60 years later, can we actually see any legacy of this shock in 1940s and 1950s? And what I do is I have individual level data from a number of countries. And so essentially, I want to see whether the residents of the repopulated regions are any different in terms of how much social capital they possess compared to similar respondents after controlling for a broad array of individual level socioeconomic characteristics, whether they have a different level of social capital compared to other individuals in the same country. In the sense that I'm not comparing, say, Czechs from Sudetenland with Norwegians. We know that Czechs on average have lower social capital than the Norwegians. But essentially the comparison that I have is I have treated regions of the Czech Republic and I have control regions of the Czech Republic. I have treated regions of Poland and control regions of Poland and so on. Right, so this is essentially my quasi-experimental design. And now I'll tell you a bit about these particular regions. How much time do I have altogether?
Take your time, I don't know.
Okay, that's all I wanted to hear. Now, nice thing about this paper is I like maps and I like history, and I have both in this part of the paper. Basically, what you see here, anybody from Poland here? Okay, so what you see here, this is two maps of Poland in one. The white area was Poland and it is Poland. The gray area used to be Poland in the interwar period. And the red area is currently Polish and used to be German. This is Eastern Prussia with Kaliningrad and Königsberg to the north, and so on. This is Wrocław, Szczecin, Gdansk, or Danzig is around here, and so on. Basically, these regions, they were German for a long time. The Poles argue that they used to be Polish for, at certain point during, I think, the Piast dynasty. But basically, at the time of the end of the Second World War, most of these regions were essentially German. This part here includes regions that were historically Polish, such as Lwów, which was basically a Polish city. Tarnopol is around here. Vilno, or now Vilnius. These were regions of Poland that had a Polish majority during the interwar period. The rest was essentially Polish conquest, where Poles took advantage of the chaos in Russia after the revolution. There was a Polish-Russian war, and Poles had the upper hand, and they managed to bite quite more than what originally thought they would be able to hold. But again, so what I consider here is, I don't consider all of these, this is now this is Ukraine, there's Belarus and Lithuania. I only consider those areas which used to have a Polish majority. So more than 50% of the population were Polish, and that's Lviv or Lviv. Now Tarnopol, which is not here on this map, but it's next to Lviv, and Vilna or Vilnius, and I ignore the rest. These areas were annexed by the Soviet Union. The Polish population was essentially driven away. There was no formal expulsion, but the lives of the Poles were very quickly became sufficiently miserable so that almost all of them left on their own accord. Now, on the other hand, Poland received these, what they called recovered territories, recovered again because they felt they used to hold these territories at some point in the past. The Germans were expelled, and they were replaced by, to some extent, refugees from this area. They call this Kresy, which is borderlands. So some of the refugees, or a lot of the refugees from the borderlands, went actually to the Western territories. But there were also Poles from central Poland who moved there. There were Poles moving from third countries as well, and so basically there was a mixture. The estimates are that around 7 million Germans were expelled or left on their own accord during the last months of the war, immediately after the war, and they were replaced by roughly 5 per million Poles. And again, they came from a variety of backgrounds. There were ethnic minorities in these regions which Germans considered to be part of the German people, and the Poles considered them being essentially Polish. Basically, these were originally Slavic majorities that lived in Germany, and sort of their language was kind of a mixture of Polish or Slavic and German elements. They were allowed to stay. So Kashubians, Masurians, and Silesians, they were allowed to stay in Poland. There was a relatively large Ukrainian and Belarusian population around Białystok in what was central Poland and became eastern Poland. And these people were forcibly moved to the western territories, largely because it was seen as they were potentially a destabilizing factor being so close to Ukraine, especially since there was actually still quite a lot of turmoil in Ukraine after the war when Ukraine was re-annexed to the Soviet Union. Basically, when Germans were kicked out and the Soviet army came in. There were about 150,000 Belarusians and Ukrainians who were resettled to the west. So that's one. Actually, that's two regions that I considered. So I have these regions that used to be Polish are currently Ukrainian or Lithuanian, and I have regions that used to be German and are currently Polish. Then I have the Sudetenland, and it's roughly these areas of the Czech Republic. In 1938, this was annexed by the German Reich, essentially based on the premise that a majority of the population were Germans and they wanted to join the German state. After the war, the pre-war borders of Czechoslovakia were restored, but these Germans, the Sudeten Germans, were seen as basically traitors and they were expelled involuntarily. The estimates are there were about 3 to 3.5 million of them. They were expelled in a space of a few months in 1945, mainly to West Germany, some to Austria. The people who repopulated Sudetenland, some of them came from the Czech Republic, what is now the Czech Republic. There was a lot of settlers from what now is Slovakia, because that was much less developed. And a lot of these settlers were actually opportunistically motivated, in the sense that it was kind of almost like the Wild West during that period. If you moved to Sudetenland and you found a house that was vacant, you would basically report it to the local registry or local office, and you would take possession and take ownership of the house. And so people would move there in order to take over houses. And you would literally take over the house with everything. The Germans were allowed to take very limited amount of belongings, and so you would take a house with furniture. In there would be cups and plates in the cupboards, and the bedding on the bed, and so on. Often as the pictures of the previous owners on the wall, and these settlers came in, took down the pictures, and kept everything else. There were some ethnic Czechs from other countries such as Romania, Ukraine, and elsewhere who decided to come back to the fatherland during this period. But also in Slovakia, what is now Slovakia, there was a relatively large population of ethnic Hungarians and ethnic Roma or Gypsies, and some of these were forcibly moved to Sudetenland in order to integrate them into the majority population faster. And so that's another of my quasi-experimental regions or treated areas. Then third area is Venezia Giulia, which is basically this part that used to be Italian after the First World War. So it used to be Austrian until the First World War, and then Austria lost it, ceded it to Italy as part of the post-war settlement. And this shows you the structure of population. What is blue is Italians, and what is yellow is Croats or Slovenes. Now, I could include Croatia. The problem is in Croatia, I don't have suitable regional classification. The regions that I have for Croatia are relatively large, so I don't consider Croatia in here, but I include Slovenia, where it's basically this area alongside the coast, which had a relatively large Italian population. Essentially what happened after the war, so the border used to be like this before, during the interwar period. After the war, the Allies, Americans and British, were coming from the north. The Yugoslav army of Tito was coming from the south, and essentially this is where they met for the most part, and that's essentially where the border stayed. The city of Trieste was a free city-state for a temporary period. Then they had a referendum and they decided to join Italy. The only exception was that there was a British territory in the south of Istria around Pula, and they ceded it to the rest of Yugoslavia. So that's Venezia Giulia. And then the last region is Flevoland, and this is a province in the Netherlands. This is the only case where this quasi-experiment is not a result of war, but land reclamation. And what happened here is, if in the Netherlands, they basically, so you have Amsterdam around here, and there used to be this inland sea, which they called the South Sea. So you have the North Sea to the north of the mainland, and then there was an inland sea within the Netherlands, which was causing a lot of flooding quite regularly. And so the Dutch built a dam and turned it into a lake. And it became a freshwater lake eventually. And then they decided to reclaim some of the land. And they started with these areas, which were joined to the province of North Holland. But then these two parts became a separate province. And so these are the two parts. This is the province of Flevoland. And the fact that this is a separate province allows me to use it because, with the exception of the island of Urk, essentially all of Flevoland is reclaimed territory. And the island of Urk, or now the town of Urk, accounts for roughly 5% of the population of the province these days. So essentially, 95% of the inhabitants of Flevoland are settlers from elsewhere in the Netherlands. And so here, this is almost an ideal experiment. Almost no one has stayed. Everybody who is there, with the exception again of the Urkers, is a settler or a descendant of settlers. On top of it, the Dutch government, during the period when they were allowing settlement of Flevoland, they didn't just let people settle where they wanted. They allocated them to specific places so that people would be mixed. And the reason for that was that they didn't want to have sort of a colonies of different regions in the Netherlands. So the people from Amsterdam would be in one village, people from Rotterdam would be in another village, and so on. And so they were deliberately mixed. And as a result of that, Flevoland has long been called the only province of the Netherlands where people actually speak Dutch and not a regional dialect. And the reason for this was when people moved there, they realized that they couldn't understand the neighbors. And so they were forced to speak what is the officially registered language. And so they created essentially dialect-free region. Okay, so these are my treated regions. Now, I identify these with present-day provinces or regions in these countries that approximately correspond to the affected regions. Sometimes the correspondence is better, in some cases it's better than in others, but essentially I have these regions that are now Polish and used to be German. I have these regions that used to be German and are now Czech. These regions used to be Polish and are now Ukrainian. This used to be Italian, and these two regions used to be Italian, are now Slovenian, and this used to be the sea, and it's now a Dutch province. Now, the data that I use is the European Social Survey, and this is a survey carried out based on a unified questionnaire, a unified methodology in 30 countries, mostly in Europe, but it includes Israel, Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey as well. And I will show you the measures of social capital that I have. Importantly, I have quite detailed socioeconomic information on the individual respondents. Actually, I used to have happiness and health. I dropped it, so forget about this. Now, importantly, all my regressions include country fixed effects. And so by doing this, I account for the average social capital in each country. And this is why I say that even though I include up to 30 countries per wave, the comparison is not people from one country being compared with people from another country. The comparison is within countries. I also include wave dummies. And now, how do I measure social capital? The first question is the standard generalized trust question. So this would be the bridging social capital, basically all three of these measures. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or you can't be too careful when dealing with people? And people answer this on a scale from 0 to 10, 10 being high social capital. Then there's a question on fairness. Do you think that most people would try to take advantage of you if they got the chance, or would they try to be fair? And again, higher values correspond to higher social capital or higher fairness, perceived fairness. Would you say that most of the time people try to be helpful, or that they are mostly looking out for themselves? Again, so how helpful people are. And then this is more social relationships and networks. How often do you meet socially with friends, relatives, or work colleagues? And this could be bonding capital in principle, although possibly it could be both. Do you have anyone with whom you can discuss intimate and personal matters? Basically, networks. Compared to other people of your age, how often would you say you take part in social activities? Again, social activities, social ties. The aspect of this question where compared to other people of your age, that is potentially important. So people are not just supposed to comment how much they socialize themselves, but whether they socialize more than other people who are otherwise similar to them. And these are the average numbers. Georgia is not here, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately, because I think social capital is not particularly high in Georgia, as far as I understand. But I don't know if you can see it, some numbers are in bold. These are the highest numbers. And so the most trusting people are the Danish. The people are perceived to be the fairest in in Denmark, again, so in Denmark, and helpful also in Denmark. Sometimes I have more than one. No. Sorry?
The source of it is.
It's the European Social Survey. Yeah. But basically, Scandinavian countries tend to have the highest level, especially in terms of trust, fairness, and that kind of stuff. When it comes to socializing, the best place in Europe to be is Norway and Portugal. But when it comes to discussing, having someone to discuss intimate and important issues, Switzerland, and social activities, we have Bulgaria doing very well, and I think that's it, yeah. Now, these are not always on the same scale. This is 0 to 10, this is 1 to 7, 0 or 1, 1 to 5. So you can't really compare them necessarily. I mean, 3 is a relatively high number here, but would be a low number here. Now, the worst place is, for the most part, Turkey is doing really badly. So for instance,
they don't believe each other as well, yeah?
Basically, yeah. So Turks don't trust each other. So not only Norwegians wouldn't buy a carpet from in the Grand Bazaar and trust that it's really something valuable, but the Turks wouldn't trust either. And I have a Turkish co-author, and I can very well understand this actually. And we actually did go to the Grand Bazaar together. So yeah, so Turks don't trust each other. They don't think other people are fair or helpful. They also don't have anyone to confide in. So basically, if you compare it, almost everybody in Switzerland has someone to discuss intimate matters. 59% of Turks have someone. So if something is bothering you, you have almost 1 in 2 probability in Turkey that you can confide in someone. And they're not very socially active. The only place that takes the bottom position with respect to socializing, here we have Hungary. Hungarians are a little bit less social than Turks, actually quite a bit less social when I look at it. But yeah, so this is the sort of the distribution of social capital across Europe, yeah.
If you take these data, what is the correlation with GDP? Do you know, or?
I don't know here, but I have an earlier paper where we made actually this point. The GDP, if you include GDP in a regression, it is very highly significant. GDP per capita.
Highly significant, but not necessarily with a high coefficient, or?
That I don't remember, but it's essentially. So we have this earlier paper with Garida Gurjani, where we argue that if you basically we had a dummy for post-communist countries, and we wanted to see what do we have to throw into the regression to make it disappear. And with GDP per capita and corruption, I think we essentially got the dummy to be insignificant. So GDP per capita and quality of institutions seem to matter for this.
Are there experimental studies where, so for example, there is this kind of trust game where I give you an amount of money that is tripled, and then you can give me money back if you want. Has this been played with? Has this been correlated with these kind of questions? Because to be honest, these questions, I'm personally not convinced at the moment that this says so much about real behavior. I mean, you ask some questions. How much do you trust people? That's pretty abstract. I don't know. I mean, I would like to see if it is really correlated with actual behavior.
That's a good question. I off the top of my head, I don't remember whether I think it has been done, but I've seen papers that looked at behavior in this kind of games. There's one paper, for instance, that compared to North and South Koreans, but these were South Koreans and North Korean refugees in South Korea, not people who live in North Korea. And there they actually found a little difference between them in terms of how much they're prepared to trust in these games. if I remember the paper correctly. And I think there are other papers that have done that, but yeah, I would have to look into the literature to give you a better answer. Okay. Right. Anyway, so this is the distribution of social capital. Like I said, so GDP per capita seems to be correlated with social capital, but then what is the direction of causality? Because you have all these papers that argue that GDP per capita is high in places like Scandinavia because people have high stock of social capital. So in principle, it can go both ways. But by and large, Western European countries, and especially Nordic countries, have high social capital. Eastern European countries have lower social capital. Southern European countries and Turkey have low social capital. Greece is not doing very well. Actually, here Greece is tied with Turkey with respect to helpfulness, for instance. So yeah, I think Hungary tends to be one of the pretty miserable places as well. Anyway, so this is about, until now, roughly 3/4 of my presentation. So, you know, if you're getting nervous and impatient, there's not that much stuff left. I will show you a few regressions, but basically only, I think, 3 tables. In the first table, I estimate a baseline model where I don't control for the repopulated regions, but essentially I want to see what are the determinants of social capital at the individual level. And so I have these different measures of social capital, and I try to explain them with individual characteristics. What I find is, so it's basically pretty similar to what we found with Clarida Gurjani in our earlier paper a couple of years ago. Gender doesn't make that much of a difference. I mean, at least not consistently. It can be positive or negative depending on which question you look at. Age does play an important role, and it's sort of it's U-shaped in the sense that basically your social capital declines with age until you reach something like 30, 35 years of age, and then it starts to improve. Now, this is with respect to trust, helpfulness, and fairness. With respect to social ties and socializing, we also observe a U-shaped pattern, but basically the turning point is around the age of 60 or 70. No, actually 80. So essentially, it's more or less negative throughout. People who are educated have more social capital. People who are students have more social capital. People who are unemployed, inactive, or ill have less social capital, not surprisingly. Retired people are less trusting, but they have more fun, more social activities. And ethnic minorities have less social capital by and large. And you can see that here. So this is the U-shaped effect of age. This is a positive effect of education. Income is important, and we control for income rather than controlling for nominal income. We have a measure where people are asked how well they cope with their household income, whether they're comfortable, just okay, comfortable. They're coping, they have a hard time, and it's very difficult for them to cope. And I think comfortable is the omitted category here. So essentially, everybody who is not comfortable has less social capital. And this is the different occupations, etc. So that's the baseline. And then we add the controls for the resettled regions. And essentially, what we find, so basically this is 6 regressions. 6 regressions for each of these variables in one table. So I don't replicate the individual characteristics. They're very similar in this regression as well. But what I add is a dummy that controls for the repopulated regions. Now, this is a dummy for all the regions that I showed you at the beginning. This is the same dummy, but slightly differently defined for the Czech Republic in one of the waves. Because for one of the waves, I have different regional specification for that one country that allows me to define the repopulated regions slightly differently. And so here I define the repopulated regions consistently across all waves. Here I take advantage of the more precise information for the Czech Republic in one of the waves. But both of these first two rows are for all waves together. And basically, if social capital were highly persistent, we would expect significant and negative coefficients everywhere. What we see is one negative and significant coefficient, one positive and significant coefficient. Everything else is insignificant. So basically, there's no pattern going either way. These regions are not lagging behind. They're not doing better. Now, then I do it wave by wave. I have 4 waves. This is only the first wave, nothing significant. Second wave, nothing significant. Third wave, 1 negative, 1 positive, nothing significant otherwise. Fourth wave, nothing significant. So, yeah.
You're really an unlucky guy, right? Because I wasn't at your first talk about these Fridays. I just read in the abstracts that you also don't have a result, that there's any impact. So unfortunately, you make this huge machinery, and finally it turns out that there is no impact.
Well, now I'm essentially becoming a crusader for the appreciation of insignificant results. And I think it's wrong when people dismiss insignificant results, because basically you have a question. And the question is, does X have an impact on Y? And there are 2 possible answers, yes or no. And if the answer is no, that means you have an insignificant coefficient. But if the question is interesting, then the no answer is just as interesting as the yes answer. And that's what I'm saying in this paper. That's what I was saying in the other paper. Yeah, strangely enough, I chose 2 papers to present here where I am actually very proud to have insignificant results. Not all of my papers are insignificant. But yeah, anyway, to show you a few more insignificant results. So here I had one dummy collecting all of these coefficients, all of these regions, basically treating them together. Now, in principle, these regions are not all the same, in the sense that some of them overlap with the repopulated regions better than others. In the experience of, say, the repopulated regions that are in Poland is not necessarily the same as Sudetenland or Flevoland, for that matter. So instead of having one dummy for all of them, here I have dummy for each of these regions. Basically, again, I run a regression with, so altogether I have something like 150 to 170,000 observations. And for each of these individuals, there's a dummy whether they're resident in Flevoland or not. This is a region in the Czech Republic and so on, these are the Polish regions. And again, what we would expect if there was a negative effect of social capital in at least some of these regions, then we would expect some of these dummies to have a lot of stars and minuses in front of them. And we don't see that. I have something like, 50, 60 coefficients here. Most of them are insignificant. I think I actually counted the positive and negative coefficients that are significant, and you can't say that you have more of one than the other. Basically, these coefficients are more or less as likely to be significant and positive as they're as being significant and negative. Overall, we don't see any systematic pattern for all of the regions together or for any of these regions. If I say Flevoland were to be particularly critically affected by the repopulation, at least we should see negative coefficients here. We don't. Or for any of these other regions. And so that essentially brings us to the conclusions. Again, this means either my whole experiment is badly designed and there was never a negative shock, And I hope that I convince you, at least to some extent, to believe that there was a negative shock affecting these repopulated regions. And if you accept that, then essentially these results mean that these repopulated regions that experienced a negative shock to their social capital 50 or 60 years ago have recovered from this. Basically, there's no lasting effect. And so after roughly 2 generations, the social capital has been rebuilt. And so social capital can regenerate, can be rebuilt relatively quickly. The fact that it hasn't been rebuilt quickly in Italy may be due to something else, and I will actually discuss that on the next slide. But it is possible to rebuild it relatively quickly, and historical legacies need not be that important, as is argued by Putnam and the other people. Anyway, so going back to Italy, how can we actually, so in this case, how can we make sense of my results and reconcile them with Putnam's observation that social capital is lower? And so this I don't dispute. Social capital was and probably still is low in the Mezzogiorno, in the south of Italy. But now the question is it really because of the historical legacy of the Norman kingdom, or is it because of something else? Now, there's one thing that Putnam says. He emphasizes the role of organized crime as essentially one of the manifestations of this low social capital. And he actually says mafia arose in the south of Italy because, on the one hand, weak enforcement of laws and contracts, so basically weak state, weak rule of law, but also because of the ancient culture of mistrust. And so again, there's this emphasis on the historical legacy, on the long history that created favorable situation, favorable foundations, breeding grounds for the mafia and the other organized crime groups to emerge. However, mafia only emerged relatively recently. Mafia is no more than 200 years old. Essentially, all the sources that I was able to find argue that it emerged sort of gradually sometime between the end of feudalism, the end of serfdom in the south of Italy, which was 1812, and the Italian reunification in 1860, or the annexation of the south by the Piedmontese, by the north in 1860. Now, what happened at the time was when the serfdom was abolished, land was redistributed. Until then, there were relatively few landowners who owned a lot of land, and they provided law enforcement privately. They had their own militias, and these militias made sure that people followed the letter of the law. When they lost their land holdings, they disbanded the militias. And so essentially there was this period where there was very poor law enforcement. At the same time, there were a lot of new landowners with small land holdings who were vulnerable to predation by criminals. And so there was a lot of banditry, sort of disorganized crime, rather than organized crime. But there was a high level of crime in response to the removal of law enforcement by the nobility, and the fact that suddenly there were a lot of people who had some assets which could be taken away. And this is essentially when, in response to this, people turned to the mafia, or the mafia emerged to provide law enforcement informally. And when the Italian state when Italy annexed the south, they didn't put in place institutions that would, again, provide effective law enforcement. And so the mafia became entrenched. And essentially, this is why we have this protection money. I showed you the map. This is what started to be popular during this period, that there would be a local mafia boss. And if you owned a farm, or you owned a shop, or you owned a workshop, you would pay the mafia boss in your village to make sure that you don't come to any harm. And this is the origin of the protection money. But so essentially, mafia took advantage of this gap in the market where the state wasn't providing law enforcement and enforcement of contract, rule of law and enforcement of contract, and they provided an alternative structure. Now, what happened next is that the mafia captured the local government in the south. And there was essentially this sort of exchange where the politicians needed votes, mafia needed, or organized crime needed money, and they traded with one another. The organized crime would make sure that people in the district controlled by a particular clan would vote for a particular politician, and then the politician would give contracts to the local mafia boss. And there's a number of references that actually document this. Now, this is the Mezzogiorno. Similar things seem to have happened in Russia as well after the end of communism. The communist regime was replaced by a relatively weak state, and this was effectively captured by what emerged as organized crime. Some people say this was essentially the KGB that sort of turned into organized crime, or the oligarchs, and essentially the governments of many of these post-communist states were captured by these kind of structures. And as long as this kind of weak law enforcement and state-sponsored corruption persists, you will have little trust, because you can't trust others because the others are not necessarily trustworthy. And it's only in those countries that manage to break this link between state authorities and organized crime that are doing relatively well. And so that's why it is only in the south of Italy that organized crime captured the local politicians. That's why we see this difference between north and south. Some countries, some post-communist countries did a lot better than, for instance, Russia. And so the level of corruption is much higher in Russia or in Bulgaria than, for instance, Poland or the Czech Republic. And in that respect, you would expect Poland and the Czech Republic and some of those countries to do a lot better in the future, also with respect to social capital. Now here, Georgia is kind of an interesting case because corruption has gone down a lot in Georgia, and Georgia has been celebrated for this. But as far as I know, social capital is still pretty low. And maybe it just takes time for this to... And essentially, these results imply that there's a complementarity between formal institutions and social capital. If you don't have effective rule of law and contract enforcement, then social capital is not productive. And so it's no wonder that people don't trust each other. And again, this would be the case in South Italy. You can't trust others because you never know whether that person is a member of a mafia or not. Same thing in Russia. You can't trust someone else because if you enter a business deal with that person and he can bribe the court when you have a dispute, then you lose your money. And so no wonder that